Hello there, this is EssenceOfThought here, and welcome to a new episode of my review of iERRA's newest Dawa apologetics book, The Eternal Challenge, A Journey Through the Miraculous Qur'an. Today I'll be going over the chapter, What are its main themes? So let's get started. Belief in God Almighty. The essence of the Qur'an, monotheism, is captured in its 112th chapter. Say, He is God the One, God the Eternal. He begot no one, nor was he begotten. No one is comparable to him. You can think of this chapter of the Qur'an as the manifesto of monotheism in Islam. It tells us that God is one. This isn't one in the sense of one which can become two, and two which can become three, and so on. This is one and uniquely one that cannot become two. So it is impossible for him to make others onto himself. Doesn't that mean that we as humans can do something he cannot? Funny, I thought you believed your deity to be all-powerful, yet placing restrictions on his power is in direct contradiction of this. It tells us that there is some greater force than Allah dictating to Allah what Allah may do. Put simply, according to you, Allah cannot do what he simply wants, refuting the all-powerful bit. But how can we know that our Creator is one? Why can't there be two or three? We can come to this conclusion through reason, a gift given to us by God, which allows us to ponder and reflect on the universe around us and make conclusions about it. It is like when an art historian looks at a series of paintings without knowing the name of the painter, but can identify the artist who created them based on the signature style of the painting. So when it comes to our divine origins, what can we conclude based on the universe around us? It turns out that there is consistent design throughout nature. There are many repeating numbers such as the Fibonacci sequence. This mathematical series of numbers has been described as nature's code. Fibonacci numbers recur over and over in many unrelated phenomena in nature. These numbers can be seen from the smallest of things to the largest, from biological systems to inanimate objects. A swirling pattern known as the golden spiral is one example of a shape based on these numbers. Examples in nature that exhibit this pattern include a snail shell, the shapes of galaxies, the swirling formation of hurricanes, flowers, and even our fingerprints. You can think of these patterns as a consistent design signature. This consistent design signature in nature shows the oneness of the Creator who made it all. How? How do these imagined golden spirals prove one designer? How do they prove a designer, first of all? Here your sources have failed you on both fronts. Many of the natural phenomenon touted as displaying the golden spiral do not, and a simple experiment that any of you can do, using a program like Photoshop or GIMP, will display that. No matter how much you scale or attempt to align many of these images, they just won't match. You could discount these, but that's confirmation bias and selective sampling. So what we are left with in reality is spirals look like spirals. The fact that this is in any way considered evidence of a yet unproven deity's existence would be comedic, were it not taken so seriously. Apophenia is a term used to refer to the human condition which has a tendency to perceive meaningful conditions where they do not exist. It is possibly a vestigial remnant of our ape ancestry, where seeing a big cat in tall grass, even when it wasn't there, was far better than not seeing a big cat when it really was there. This is one of the many aspects that the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster has parodied, calling out other religions on the shape of DNA when compared to fusilli pasta, designed long before humankind even knew about DNA. Fact is that, unlike your golden spirals, DNA is universal to all known life, yet still means nothing, just like your non-golden spirals. Another example of consistent design throughout nature is DNA. DNA is genetic information which all living creatures carry in each of their cells. All genes in every living creature are coded messengers for how to build the organism. You can think of them as blueprints. Even though living things may outwardly appear to be different, at the genetic level, because of their shared creator, they can be very similar. For example, as humans, we share approximately 50% of our DNA with banana trees. We find that the DNA, the blueprint, is shared by all living things across nature. This common design points to a common designer, one creator behind it all. No, it simply points to common origin. In science, that is the common ancestor which has been proven to exist. In your religion, that is God. Fact is, you have an issue. You believe humankind to be special, not because of their evolved abilities, but simply because God wanted you to be special. Well, if God really wanted to divide humanity from animal and plant kind, why did he make us with the leftovers? Your assertions here are without basis and actually raise numerous issues for you, so maybe think about it next time. What would be the case if there were multiple gods, multiple creators? Polytheistic religions, religions that believe in multiple gods, always portray these gods with distinct personalities. This is why the religions are filled with tales of dispute among the gods, as their personalities clash. A good example is Hinduism, where the god Shiva is said to have cut the head off the god Ganesh and later replaced his head with an elephant. If there were multiple gods, multiple creators, then this would be reflected in the reality of the world around us. The state of creation would likely be chaotic, and the blueprints across nature would surely differ. Each god, with its own distinct personality, would impose its own design on its own creations. If there were various gods who made the different things we see today, it would be reasonable to assume that even those things which look the same are very different at a microscopic level. Therefore, evidence in nature points us to the conclusion that there must rather be one creator. Why? You say it is reasonable, so reason. They could simply have a designated creator, or maybe magic just works in a single way, or they could divide the jobs whilst having an agreed template, or maybe the Mormons are right and every god has their own planet. There are so many equally valid alternatives to what you are asserting here, so don't pretend that you've got the one solution, even on the theistic front, let alone the scientifically accurate one. So just stop there and get on with the evidence. A critic may point out that things that are engineered are generally made by more than one creator. For example, cars. When it comes to the creation of cars, one person designs the engine, another person designs the braking system, and so on and so forth. Is this a valid argument? There may be a possibility of multiple designers or creators collaborating with one another in the human domain, as illustrated by the car example. But there cannot be more than one God in the domain of the divine. This is because when we think of God, we think of a divine being with a will. God does whatever he wills. In other words, God by definition is a being that has unlimited imposing will, unless he wants to create a being like himself. For the sake of argument, what would be the situation if there were two gods and a conflict arose between them? Say they each wanted to move a rock in opposite directions. Since both of their wills cannot be enforced, there are only two possibilities. 1. They agree to compromise and have the same will. This would mean that both their wills are now limited and passive, which would mean that they are not gods anymore by definition. Yet, the same rule does not apply to a deity that wants to create another like himself, go from 1 to 2, yet some reason can't due to some mystical force greater than him. 2. One overpowers the other. It is this dominant God that is the true God. As you can see in this example, it is impossible to have multiple wills. The will of any God which is not realized cannot be considered God. This is the simplest and most logical explanation for the order and stability of the universe around us. There is only one unlimited imposing will, one God, and he alone deserves our worship. Except you have limited him earlier on when you stated that God cannot create another like him. Because you have limited his power, therefore imposed your will, your thoughts on him, and said what he can and cannot do. So you have just contradicted yourself and again refuted the God of the Qur'an. Now, here you raised a valid excuse, and rather than tackle it, simply retorted, it isn't God if it isn't Allah, because Allah is God. Your definition of a deity is relatively new on the block, and does not erase countless millennia of alternatives, no matter how many statues you deface. Even if you call these creating beings by some other name, they still offer an alternative explanation to what you proposed. Your redefining of God therefore doesn't resolve the issue. It simply waylays it and tries to derail conversation, and fails to do so as it refutes yourself. Well done. Getting back to the chapter of the Qur'an, in the next verse we are also told that God is eternal. God the Eternal. This means that he has no beginning and will never come to an end. A common question many people ask is, who created God? If we use reason, we come to the conclusion that God must be uncreated due to the absurdity of a never-ending chain of creators. To illustrate this better, if the creator of the universe had a creator, and that creator had a creator, and that creator had a creator, and so on and so forth, then we wouldn't have a universe. Imagine if you were told that you couldn't read this book until someone else read it before you, and that person also couldn't read it until someone else read it before them, and this went on forever. Would anyone ever read this book? The answer is no. Now, if we apply this principle to the universe, then we would have to conclude that the creator behind it is uncreated out of rational necessity, because for the universe to be in existence, we could not have an infinite number of creators. We rather need one eternal creator. Or we simply cut the unnecessary step of God out of the picture and simply hand one of his qualities over to the universe, which, by the way, in acknowledging that quality is possible, you assert that the universe could also do it. You can't argue that God can do it, but the universe can't, because that is special pleading. Inserting Wu as an explanation is philosophical murder. In analogy, I can achieve what you claim you can do with the death of one innocent, but I can do it without resorting to violence at all. You even boast that I'd be silly to kill an infinite number of people when you can do it with just one. Meanwhile, I sit there shaking my head. So try that for an analogy. The next verse tells us that God does not have any children or parents. He begot no one, nor was he begotten. Why would a supreme God not have any children or parents. The final verse of the chapter answers this question. No one is comparable to him. Everything within the creation has to be produced in order for life to continue. In other words, we have offspring out of the need for survival. Some people have children for other reasons, such as wanting to be looked after when they become old or frail. This is also a need. But if God is unlike his creation, then he does not have any needs, and so he does not beget. Then why create us? You may say want, but want emerges from need, and need comes from necessity. All actions carried out by conscious entities have some basis in need. Without said basis, there is absolutely nothing to distinguish said apparent desire from random chance, meaning that through this little cubite you have defined your deity as that without reason, i.e. chaos in the strictest sense. I don't think you intended to do that, but you did it anyway. Well done. Another point worth mentioning is the notion of the creator being distinct from the creation. For example, if a person were to create a chair or table, then that person would not become the chair or table. We are distinct and disjoined from what we make. Similarly, God created the universe, and therefore the universe is distinct and disjoined from him. An interesting point is that the Qur'an says that belief in a creator is the natural state of all human beings. So, Prophet, as a man of pure faith, stand firm and true in your devotion to the religion. This is the natural disposition God instilled in mankind. There is, in fact, psychological, sociological, and anthropological evidence to support this notion. Oxford University psychologist Dr. Olivera Petrovich, an expert in psychology of religion, conducted some studies concerning the psychology of the human being and God's existence. She discovered that infants are hardwired to believe in God, and atheism has to be learned. Now here's the thing. I have to decipher whether or not you are lying, or if you were simply lied to. Petrovich has not published any research on the religious beliefs of children, innate or otherwise. You would have known this had you actually read your cited source, which is the Age National, a blog written by Barney Zwartz, a conservative rabbi. The blog post is not a peer-reviewed journal article and makes no reference to such. The main reason for this, as previously noted, Petrovich has not published her research in such a journal. Why? Well, for starters, she would have to declare conflict of interest due to her research having been funded by the Templeton Foundation, a quasi-intellectual institution that doesn't set out to find out what's true, but rather with the goal of retrofitting science to match religious and spiritual belief. Now, the reason I know iERROR is lying somewhere along the chain is that I have repeatedly dragged numerous individuals, including Hamza Tzortzis, out on this over the past 2 years. At one point, Hamza thought it would be smart to throw Petrovich's publishing list at me as supposed sources he'd read, not knowing that I would meticulously go through each one and demonstrate that he is either A, lying about having read them, or B, lying about what they contain, or maybe a mixture of the two.
I mean, that's not the only one.
Well, it's not the only one. It's definitely not the only one. There's more. And for example, we said the key psychological issues in the study of religion. We have Science Points to God, which was published in 2002. We have in the International Journal of Psychology by Petrovich, it's called Japanese Children's Explanation of the Origins of Natural Objects, some comparisons with UK children.
Yep.
She has in the Journal of Psychological Reports, 1999, Preschool Children's Understanding of the Dichotomy Between the Natural and Artificial. We also have in the International Journal of Psychology, Childhood Artificialism and Early Ontological Knowledge. We also have The Philosophy of Moral Development, Volume 1, Petrovich, 1982, in the British Journal of Psychology, and there's a few more.
And just before we move on, Peter, this was the point. If you had sincerely asked Hamza...
No, there's more.
Okay,
Actually,
there's a lot more. Just before the icing on the cake, Peter, do you see the point? If you were sincere and asked him, he would have given you these resources.
Exactly.
And you would have made a fool of yourself.
Instead of searching and not doing good research and then calling me a liar.
Research.
Suffice to say, this leaves me less than impressed. In fact, it dredges up feelings of anger and frustration, in that once again I must now clean the dishonest mess left by iERRA before their rectally sourced research causes the entire field of social science to stink. It is as if you have just found yourself on my doorstep, and yes, that makes me a little less than pleasant in my reaction. So let's recap what Petrovich has and has not published quickly. The most recent publishing was a journal article discussing the many difficulties in studying religious psychology. The one before that, a non-peer-reviewed chapter in a book written by clergymen and believers to retrofit science to their mold of religion. Before that, we have the most relevant being a lecture abstract of a talk given in 2000 about preliminary results of a study, yet said results were never published. This is a single paragraph in said journal to note what the lecture, which will be given at a later date, would be about, so people could decide whether or not to attend. The study before that displayed that children were able to dichotomize between natural and artificial objects, i.e., they were able to look at an acorn and see that this acorn was not designed and created. The one before that was a lecture abstract of said later study. This is before we get to the oldest four, each focusing on moral development with zero connection to an innate religious or theistic belief. No matter what you have been told or heard, whether it exists on a questionable blog post by a rabbi or even from Petrovich herself, really matters until she has published her research in a peer-reviewed academic journal. Why? Because Petrovich could, and most likely is, warping the real implications of her study. I make this accusation on her hesitation to publish said results where they can be verified or questioned, only intending to publish in a non-peer-reviewed book in the new year. So stop using Petrovich. It is incredibly dishonest and only reveals once again that iERRA is not willing to change. Professor Justin L. Barrett did some research by looking at the behavior and claims of children. He concluded that children believed in what he calls natural religion. This is the idea that there is a personal being that created the entire universe. The being cannot be human, it must be divine, supernatural. Scientific research on children's developing minds and supernatural beliefs suggests that children normally and rapidly acquire minds that facilitate belief in supernatural agents. Not long after their first birthday, babies appear to understand that agents, but not natural forces or ordinary objects, can create order out of disorder. Who is the creator? Children know people are not good candidates. It must have been a god. Children are born believers of what I call natural religion. Did you read the same quote as me? Children normally and rapidly acquire minds that facilitate belief in supernatural agents. This belief is in no way innate, but rather a child's mind develops the ability to comprehend concepts, yet due to an absence of critical thinking skills, not taught until much later, they are more likely to fall victim to superstition. If I acquired a brain tumor from reading this material, that would not mean I was born with a brain tumor. This phenomenon is why evangelical Christians began the 4 to 14 window. This is the age range where children can understand reasonably complicated narratives, yet lack vital skepticism. Therefore, it is easier to snare children during this age range. Any earlier and the child cannot understand belief in deities that well. Any later and education is likely to have taken effect, making indoctrination difficult. Fact is that this is not simply my interpretation, as I can support this with a quote from Barrett himself, given when a secularist attacked the fake position you have just presented. Had Grayling attended the seminar as Brown did, or read my book, Why Would Anyone Believe in God?, he would know that I do not say that religion is hardwired or innate. Rather, that children have propensities to believe in gods because of how their minds naturally work. So Barrett has made it all too clear that he is not saying what you claim he is saying, a fact that you have no excuse for. Why? Well, because I quoted this in person to none other than Hamza Tzortzis himself at the dawn of 2014, after having done so online repeatedly in 2013. iERRA talks about wanting to improve their work, and yet here they are, still using the same dishonest information that was shown to be so years ago. Also, as much as Mr. Barrett believes Grayling's issue with who has been in his pocket to be irrelevant, that's not the case. The fact that the Templeton Foundation played a part in his research is discouraging. The reason that this is such a large issue can be seen in the MMR vaccine scare created by Andrew Wakefield, a person paid £435,000 by solicitors wanting to sue vaccine manufacturers. That conflict of interest is why it is key to list any problem elements in a peer-reviewed academic journal, and it is not simply a petty insult. When you have a theist on the payroll of a religious institution which wants to break science to fit religion, you have an issue. This is especially true when, as seen, said organization monopolizes this front. This can pressure researchers into utilizing exaggeration and massaging statistics. Yet ultimately, Barrett disagrees with you and Olivera's research does not exist. So what do you have to stand on? Nothing. Let's consider the atheism of communist Russia and communist China. The Soviet Union was the first state to have an ideological objective to eliminate religion and replace it with atheism. The vast majority of people in the Russian Empire were, at the time of the Communist Revolution, religious believers, whereas the communists aimed to break the power of all religious institutions and eventually replace religious belief with atheism. Toward that end, the communist regime confiscated church property, ridiculed religion, harassed believers, and propagated atheism in the schools. Criticism of atheism was strictly forbidden and sometimes led to imprisonment. In spite of this, atheists still had signs of what you call a worship instinct, which relates to the natural state that the Qur'an speaks of. For example, their big statues of Stalin and Lenin were almost revered. When you look at different cultures, you can see this worship instinct coming through. This instinct even manifests itself in atheist cultures. The fall of communism saw a rapid revival of religion, which is flourishing today in Russia. If belief in God is nothing more than an ideology, something that people are indoctrinated with by their parents, then shouldn't these efforts by the Communist Party over the space of several generations have undone religious convictions? All this evidence leads to one conclusion. Belief in God is not taught but exists naturally within human beings. Therefore, when pondering God, the question shouldn't actually be does he exist, but rather, what reasons do we have to reject his existence? Because God's existence is self-evidently true, except that's complete and utter rubbish, and this is simply a transparent attempt to shift the burden of proof, because you know as a believer you actually lack any reason to convince others to believe in said deity, thus you must presuppose his existence and assert that it's up to us to disprove his existence, which is fallacious to no end. Well, to answer your earlier question, no. Religious suppression over a period of 30 to 40 years will not necessarily lead to the removal of an institution that has existed for millennia. I'm going for the end of the Second World War and not the start of the Soviet Union, as following the Nazi invasion, Stalin was quick to revive the Russian Orthodox Church as a tool of war, knowing that religion is capable of getting even good men to do atrocious things in the name of God and country. Also, this controlling of the state is not necessarily controlling of what people say to their family, particularly extended families and farming families. Resistance exists as one type of fundamentalism breeds another. We saw what is termed as cultural defense in places like Poland, as the primarily Catholic nation fought back against the Soviet occupation. Yet this is all forgetting to mention that the sample you are using is contaminated. Airports and international trade influences internal affairs, meaning that your attempt to use the USSR is completely invalid. As noted, it had its hand in the Russian Orthodox Church, and I would hardly call their views on Stalin, which border on demi-theism, to be atheistic, a fact that you note yourselves. A contaminated sample does not prove your point. It simply invalidates your sample. Meanwhile, I can provide a sample that until recently was completely isolated from the rest of the world and therefore both major religion and philosophy. I speak of course of the Petrovich tribe. This tribe of Amazonian natives who lacked access to the outside world develops their culture upon an empirical basis, requiring every statement made to include a denotation of where the information comes from, i.e., did they see it, hear it, etc. Now, as with many isolated populations, once they are discovered, missionaries will rush to the scenes in an attempt to convert them to their religions. But what they did not expect was to come across a culture that had no words for God or magic. This fact made conversion impossible. Missionaries found that without the power structures built over hundreds of thousands of years to favor religion, giving it a special allowance, that they were unable to convince people of modern-day religion. This led some people, such as Daniel Everett, to see their own cultural bias and the absence of reason for their beliefs, and ultimately led to their deconversion. What this little isolated tribe, this pristine and rare controlled sample, proves without an ounce of doubt is that religious belief, especially theism, is in no way innate. This falsifies your claim instantly, leaving you no room to make ad hoc excuses, as you likely would were I to bring up secular nations such as Sweden that do not enforce religion or an absence of it. They simply step back, and over time, with no special favor, the population has migrated until only 29% of Swedes are religious, and 5% of that comes from the recent Islamic fervor. So let us consider the Fitrah, the natural belief in Allah, well and truly dead, and with it the Qur'an falsified once again. Fact is, I was expecting so much more, yet I've only come away disappointed once again by the same cheap tricks as always. This book is really shaping up to be just another pathetic waste of paper. The citation you end on, that's nothing more than a link to an essay by Hamza Tzortzis that has been refuted repeatedly by numerous people, and Hamza knows this, yet he refuses to remove it. What a pitiful state of so-called academic discourse. So I guess I will see you next time with the next chapter. Hi there, this is EOT here, and whilst my generous sponsors scroll past, I would like to highlight a wonderful organisation, To Faithless, designed to give a voice to all ex-religious individuals, including many ex-Muslims. They could really use your help to grow their channel, so please drop by and give some of their videos a view. Thank you.